Michael and Andreas. Hello.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you.
I will make a short introduction of both of them. Then everybody, both of them will have a short speech, about 10 to 15 minutes, about their topic. Michael will tell us about the view from his startup side and the R&D side. He goes a little bit deeper into the ChatGPT topic or the generative AI. And then Andreas will also take 10 to 15 minutes about, and we'll look at the investor view on that topic. Because the goal of today is not to make more fire for the hype. It's also getting a realistic situation, and we want to go a little bit deeper. But the focus is on two sides. One is really to look at what means ChatGPT or generative AI for us as investors. But we also will have the view of a startup, because before November 22, the world was okay, and now it's like tumbling and rumbling, and everybody speaks about it, and there are a lot of big expectations around, which maybe we not will ever see to be met. So my two guests here is Michael Wechner. Hello, Michael. Have you on board here? Michael is the CEO of a nice AI company, which he will then tell a little bit afterwards when he's starting his speech. But just he takes the view of the R&D, because in his starting career, he was really the guy who went deep into the research and the research part of AI methods and tools, and he will explain it. And now he has since 5 years, he's a conversational AI bot on the start called Katie, and his company is called Viona. So he will be an expert and maybe suffering or laughing about what happens now. I think you have one eye which says cheers, because everybody's now able to do something you had maybe invested a lot of work in before, and on the other eye you are in the middle of the storm, so you have to help hear us going through. The other person is Andreas Goldi from B2 Ventures. I always have to remind that's the new company name now. He's founder of Nemix. He done angel investments in 2001. He went 2006 to the US and stayed there for 12 years. He made 2 times CTO, one of a not so successful startup and another one of a more successful startup in the machine learning area. And he's back in 2018 to Switzerland, and since then you're working at B2 Ventures, and it's an insider of that because they also invested in DeepL, which is one of those companies that's like the Facebook of AI thing. Good. So questions we have today, as I said, focus is really about going a little bit deeper down into the hype. And before we do that, I just want to, if somebody has seen that one, that's Sunday picture. You will see that here. Sunday Pichai, Google CEO, he made a speech, and he just like, and this is AI.
Generative AI, AI. It uses AI to bring AI.
So that's setting the scene.
Generative AI.
So you're getting nuts. So somebody has to count how many times we use the word AI. So if we can beat him, but that will be really difficult. So just setting up the scene and having a fun fact here. So I think, Michael, we start with you. You have prepared some slides, and just make an introduction to the topic as you've seen it also from the research side.
Sure. Let me share my slide. So can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay.
We'll see that.
Yeah. So, well, thank you very much, Ralph, for having me. So as Ralph already mentioned, we are a startup and which is called Katie. And I want to give you really like a short introduction how these things actually work, because from the outside, it really can look very complex and complicated. The research papers sound very difficult, but actually the core concepts are not so difficult. And I really would like to show you this now, basically. So first of all, maybe what is the daily problem? So basically the daily problem of many people is a white page, you know, that you have to write something or you have a question and you don't know how to answer it. And now if you consider this very simple example, you know, you start a sentence, let's say you have children and you have to tell them a story, you know, you start once upon a time, or in German, like es war einmal, you know, so if you learned in your childhood or whatever about the Brothers Grimm, you know, you probably will start with, you will extend the sentence one upon a time with there was a king or there was a princess, there was a frog, whatever. If you are aware of the Star Wars movie, you might make another association. You don't say there was a king, but you rather say once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, basically. And actually what we will see shortly, this is actually what ChatGPT is doing in a way, or these generative AI models, basically. And and I would really like to encourage you to observe yourself on a daily basis, how you process stimulus or input, you know. So for example, here you can see on the left-hand side, you see this animal, which looks like a zebra. But of course, if you look at it closer, you will see it's not a zebra, it's a horse, which is wearing a zebra coat. And then again, you know, if you think about it, how you make associations, how you recognize it, maybe first you see it wrong, you know, maybe first you think, oh, it's a zebra from a far distance, but then you look more closely, you start to put the pictures into segments and you recognize, oh no, it's not a zebra, but still then you make other associations with the zebra, like, okay, it's an animal from Africa, or you have like where you're walking like as a pedestrian. So, and yeah, really try to observe yourself and you will see actually what you do on a daily basis. These AI models are doing very similar things actually, or you as a human are doing very similar things. So now let's get to some basic concept. One of the most simple and actually quite amazing is like how to recognize, you know, manually written numbers, basically. And if you look at this, and I think it's an important example to look at it just very quickly, you know, one possibility to do this in the end, you want to present a picture of a handwritten number, you know, and you want to, you know, detect which number it is, basically. And one way of doing this is basically you make a grid, you know, like let's say of, I don't know, 20 pixels. So this means like you have 400 pixels, and then you know, each pixel has a number. So for example, black, it could be 0, or black could be 1, or the other way around, white could be 1, 1. And, you know, the shades are something in between 1 and 0. So you basically have 400 numbers. You have a vector of 400 numbers between 1 and 0, and you feed this into network. And then the network is kind of a black box, but whatever is in there, basically the idea is that at the end it tells you, okay, this is a 3, basically, or this is a 4, or this is a 5. And with these very early, people were able to do this actually better than humans were able to recognize this based on, you know, huge sample data, basically. Now, if you think about this, again, if you compare this, how we do this biologically, it's not so different actually, because if you see something with your eye, basically, your eye has the retina, and the retina has many receptors, basically. And each receptor is being triggered, and this is generating so-called spikes in the brain, you know, with the neurons. So, and this is actually also in a way like a 1-0 kind of encoding of the input picture. And then, of course, you process it in the brain, whatever. It's also kind of a black box in some cases, but I mean, it's not so different actually. So even this is actually quite interesting for people who can't see, you know, there's even like some attempts to make this, you know, artificially, to basically have a camera, then encode it into 1 and 0s, and then put it basically on the neurons so that people could see again. So now coming to the ChatGPT, in this sense, it's not so different. It's just like you have to think of it's a different, the black box is kind of a different architecture. But the general concept is the same. You also have an input. So instead of that, you have an input of an image, you have a text basically. And this text could be the beginning, like I said, like once upon a time, but it could also be instruction, like write a story. And what you want at the end, you want to have an output. And in this case, basically, you feed into ChatGPT, write a story, and then it starts with once. So, and what you can see here, these are the building blocks of such a transformer model. So, and of course, if you go more into details, they're a little bit more complex, but generally speaking, it's also you encode the input basically into numbers, and then there's some kind of neural network architecture, and in the end, you get an output basically. So, and now let's see a little bit more in detail how this works. So when you have a text, and this is very important, like write the story, for example, you tokenize this token. It can be the individual words, but you can also split into words. There's many techniques to this. And then you basically generate out of these vectors, basically. These can be vectors like, like this can be half a dimension of 1,000 dimension, 4,000 dimension, yeah, depending on what you're using it for. And people in AI, they call these text embeddings. Or if you just think about your math courses from high school or school, it's just normal vectors basically. It's nothing special actually. And these vectors can be now visualized too. And this is actually quite interesting to see now. So this is now like a two-dimensional space. And you see these sentences like, for example, hey, what's up? Hey, how it's going? Hello, how are you? So you as a human would immediately say, yes, these sentences are similar. Or down here, at the bottom, you have sentences about the dog, or to the right, you have bottom right, you have sentences about football. So again, each sentence you can vectorize, and this vector you can, display in for example, in this two-dimensional space, and then you can see the vectors which are close together. They have some similarities. And this is actually how a vector search or similarity search is working. It's really nothing complicated. You have these vectors, and you just look for vectors which are close to each other, and this is basically what you say is similar. What is important to understand here is that many models, they are being trained for true positives. True positive means things which are really close to each other. So for example, if you think about, how old are you, or what is your age? These sentences, they have completely different words, but it's clear to you as humans, they have the same meaning basically, they are close to each other. So, but when I ask now, not instead of, how old are you, but I ask, how is your wife today? You might also semantically sound similar. And then the system could say, okay, this is similar too, but you as a human, of course, understand this is not similar. And one of the challenges is that many of these models, they are not well enough trained on true negatives. So things which look semantically the same, but actually in reality are not considered to be similar. So, but that's one of the challenges anyways. Something which actually kind of started this revolution of ChatGPT or generative AI is the so-called attention mechanism, basically. It's based on a paper which was released by Google 2017. And basically, again, it's quite simple, actually. If you take these two sentences, the bank of the river and money in the bank, so the word bank, in both cases, the word bank is being used. But the meaning of the bank depends very much of the context. So bank of the river means something completely different than money in the bank, basically. Again, how this is being solved, and this you can see at the bottom, basically. What the mechanism is, basically, you create kind of a new word, bank one, and you make this kind of a combination out of bank and river, basically. And bank two is a combination out of bank and money. In this way, you can basically make a distinction between the meaning, and then you can use this in the models. And this is really something which is very important to these so-called transformer models, that they are making use of this mechanism. So in the end, again, you basically have an input like write a story, you send this to the transformer model, and in the end you get probabilities which word will follow next, basically. So, so here you can see one has the highest probability, somewhere has a less probability, and other words, they don't, basically are very unlikely. And this is actually how it works. It's really very simple. So you have this input, you calculate the probabilities of the next word, and then you feed this back into the model. And this is just how it's basically written new text. So maybe one thing you will ask is, why does ChatGPT change the content, even if you feed in the same input, basically the same? And this is basically done through like that you basically, instead of just always taking the one with the highest probability, you take the top K. So you take first the top 10 results, and then you take one of them. And then you can have like, there are different techniques, like for example, with a temperature parameter where you can say, depending that you make this more likely or unlikely, basically. So, and this is actually, but this is actually done artificially, so that you put in some randomness. And this is why you get different kind of text in the end, even if you have the same input. Whereas you can see, depending on the model, where they have this temperature, you can set it to 0, and then you will always get the same answer. Then you basically, it's deterministic. So now, if you think about this and start to understand a little bit better, then you start to understand actually, it's very similar. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but you know, if you have yourself children which are teenagers, or you know teenagers, and you talk to them, you know, they also imitate a lot. You talk to them and they tell you all kinds of things, and you think, wow, they really understand. But eventually you realize, no, they don't really understand. They just imitate very well what they've heard or read. And again, maybe it's a cliche. I think sometimes managers have the same behavior. They also are very good at reading things, you know, and imitating. But when you go deeper, they realize they don't really understand so well. And the problem about imitation, and this is the same problem about ChatGPT, you know, you can imitate good things and you can imitate bad things as long as you don't have values. And I think this is why it's very important to understand that there's like a missing part, basically. And this missing part is basically the reasoning. And I think this is very similar. I mean, the ones of you who know the book of Daniel Kahneman about thinking fast and slow, basically, I think we are at the stage now that we have created models or systems which are thinking fast, basically. And I think the missing part is basically the slow thinking at the moment. So, and now, and this is basically now, how can be this done? So the current state of the art is basically so-called retrieval augmented generative AI. And how are they done? So they also take a language model, you know, where you have an input, like for example, generate a summary about Joe Biden. Then the language model in the first step will create a sentence. But then instead of just claiming this is true, the model or the system then is going to, you know, retrieve, well, basically search for this in the internet and see whether this actually could make sense. If it does make sense, it keeps it. And then it continues, then it says Joe Biden attended the University of Pennsylvania. Again, then you will query to verify this statement. And then the system will realize, oh, yeah, well, he did attend a university, but it was not the University of Pennsylvania, but it was the University of Delaware. And this is how it continues. So this is kind of the state of the art, how this is being done. So to summarize a little bit, and this, I mean, we can discuss this later. I think my hypotheses are at the moment, I believe quite strongly that LLMs as they are today, they will become a commodity. And you just have to compare this, like, for example, how Linux became a commodity or email became a commodity. Then also, I think the transformer-based model, these architectures, it's not the end of the story. Again, maybe you can compare this, you know, how engines have been invented, you know, like for cars and whatever, or airplanes. And you also can see how this has changed. You know, certain things have not changed so much. They got, you know, improved, optimized. But then you had also other technologies over the last 100 years. So here, maybe later for some of you who are more interested in this, I have provided some links. I think especially Cohere actually have really very good documentation about this for people who want to get into this. But there's also, you can see how open source is catching up with Open Assistant or Vicuna, and then also some really like deeper research where you can get more into it. So this is something I would like. I don't, do I still have 1 minute, Ralph?
Yeah, sure.
Because
it's still in time.
Okay, I would like to show you quickly, because I didn't talk so much about ourselves, but I also would like to show you a video. I hope it's loading. Oh wait, why doesn't it work?
Demo effect, huh?
Yes. Yeah. Wait. No. Wait. Let me try again. Because I would like to show you how we feel at the moment as a startup. I know. Can you see the video?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait. I try to make it bigger. So try to see the players on the right-hand side. So we are the players on the right-hand side. We are the startup. So you see, we can catch the ball, we put it back. The others are very well organized. So now again, now you think it's impossible, but somehow they get it over the net again. The others are very well organized. They put it back again, you know, it's basically impossible to catch this ball. One more, impossible. And finally they win. So yes, so thank you very much. I think this is how we feel at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
We have, if you can put questions in, I have not seen any questions. So audience, it's also if you have questions, just type them in. And Christian, you have to look because I wanted to put on the Q&A questions, but I can't. So maybe it's not activated. Just a question about the language. So does those models also learn languages, and do they know they're speaking English or French or whatever, or it's just like just raw data and they know that a word in German the next word is also in German because of the statistic?
No, it's also, you have, of course, this multilingual model, or, you know, what is also very state of the art is this multimodal model, where you don't just feed in different languages, but you also feed in images, you know, at the same time, text and audio, basically, because in the end, you really have to think of it like, you know, you have some input and then you always encode this. So once it's encoded, you know, it doesn't really matter whether it was a picture or whether it was English or it was German, you know. So you just need something which is basically encoding this and putting this into vectors, basically.
Okay, good. So the languages are important as an input factor.
Yes.
Three questions. Maybe you see them, Michael. One is like a more high-level question. Will people still use ChatGPT in 5 years?
Yes. Yeah. Wait. I have to read them. Well, I mean, I think the concept itself, I'm very sure people will use. I mean, it's really fantastic. I mean, everyone I know, they use ChatGPT like because it helps them very much. Whether it be ChatGPT from OpenAI, I think that's a completely different story. And as I said, I really think generally that the technology will become a commodity. So, you know, I mean, if you really look at this example of Linux, you know, I mean, when Linux was created first, you know, people kind of didn't take it so seriously. But then, you know, really people started to recognize, hey, this is really much better. And it was replacing the big Unix systems from IBM and Sun Microsystem, basically, you know. And now if you look at it today, people don't really care anymore what Linux they're using, whether you use Ubuntu or Debian or whatever. You know, what they care about is where can I get the most convenient service? So they either go to Google or Azure, Microsoft Azure, or AWS or Linode or some other provider. And, you know, and I think the same will happen with ChatGPT, basically. I think there will be, yes, sorry.
Yeah, just we have another question, so I will keep a little bit short.
Yeah, sure.
I know that. The next question is, why do we call ChatGPT as the Bolcos? How fast can transformers improve, as it seems to be exponential? Where we hit the GPU, that means CPU limits.
At the moment, it's actually the opposite. People realize they can even, I mean, it's true for ChatGPT as it is today, it needs a lot of computing power, but actually there's a lot of research going on that it needs much less. And there are people like the links I sent you, you can really run this on very low computing power, actually. So, and I don't think necessarily this has to grow, you know. I think actually the opposite can happen too. I mean, I think I read recently, I don't know if this is true, I just recently read there's some open source models which you can run on the iPhone without a problem, basically.
Okay. That sounds interesting. Yeah. Good. The next question: why do we call ChatGPT AI, so artificial intelligence? I find myself correcting a lot of people because it's actually just an advanced large language model. Yeah, we didn't do the part where is ChatGPT exactly in the AI space. Maybe you just put some words on that, Michael.
Well, I think the thing is, of course, I would argue that you could ask the same questions for humans, you know. So when what we are doing now, the sentences I'm talking, this is basically ChatGPT, you know. I also do just the same, and I hope you consider me intelligent, basically. You know, I think it's probably a question, you know, how do you define actually intelligence? And yes, I would consider it is an intelligence. And since it's artificial, yes, I would call it artificial intelligence. Yes.
Good. Then, Françoise, as language and its components are utmost importance, did you use human linguistics to help with the coding?
Yes, there is. I mean, there's many linguists. I mean, I know, for example, at the University of Zurich, the Department of Linguists, they got very much into this space. And but yes, things have changed very much. I think the thing is a little bit like this, you know. I think linguists also recognize, in a way, I mean, of course, there's many rules, you know, to a language, to grammar and whatever. But again, you know, if you think about it, how your children learn a language, they don't need grammar, you know, they don't need to understand how a language works. They just pick up the word space, they just imitate. And this is how they learn a language. Later, eventually, they start to recognize the patterns and learn about, you know, the linguist theory behind it. But in order to learn it and to apply it, you don't need this actually. And I think this is what, you know, these models are all about. They also pick this up and imitate, basically, like children do.
Okay. So we're running a little bit out of time, and I'll just take a last questions, because also it's more on the research side. Are there many serious studies of how well AI models predict success of a startup? So that was from Didier Borel. What criteria or input does the AI need? I have seen a few, but I didn't think they were well done. There was lots of biases in them. So that's more the quality of those models.
Yeah, but if I understand the question correctly, it's basically how well you could use AI to predict whether a startup will be successful, right?
Right.
Yeah, I know there are some efforts. People try to do this. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I know the same, I think very similar, it's in the movie business. I think movie production companies also try to predict the success of a movie based on the story, the people behind it, you know, like and as far as I know, it's also not, yeah, there are many flops still, basically. I mean, I'm sure there are indicators and everything, but let's say it this way, I don't know anyone today which is actually able to do this with a high accuracy. Let's say it this way.
Maybe I can chime in quickly. So I've dealt with this topic for years now, and there are two fundamental problems. So first of all, the majority of information that you have about a startup is in unstructured form, right? Pitch decks and stuff like that. And the LLMs that we are now seeing help with processing that. So that's positive. So which has definitely driven us a bit closer to that idea. The other problem is that obviously in the future of a young startup, there's so much uncertainty. 99% of things that are going to determine if the startup is going to be successful are going to happen in the future, not now, right, of a startup. And that's extremely hard to predict. It's a high dimensional problem, and you know so little about early stage startups just as a fact, right, that you can't really apply traditional prediction models to it successfully. What I have seen in research is that you can predict total flops, but you can't predict success at this time reliably. It's a bit different for late stage startups. So once you hit Series C, D, then you have a lot more quantitative information to go by, and then it gets a bit more reliable.
Okay,
maybe just one little note, since I studied mathematical physics originally. You know, if you understand chaos theory and you know understand stable and unstable systems, the thing is, like, I would argue, as Andreas said, you know, the startups kind of like unstable systems. And, it's like then you basically have this butterfly effect. And so the AI can't actually predict, because nobody can predict, basically.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
exactly the right way. Yeah.
There's also a startup pitched at the SIGTIC event last time in Basel, Raised AI. They also want to challenge, maybe you have to challenge them with your hypothesis. Okay, thank you very much. Now, Andreas, the next 10, 50 minutes with you, and then we have some discussions. We have a lot of questions, actually, just to go through them, that's enough stuff. But let's hear some content from the investor side. Thank you.
Great, and thanks for having me, first of all. So quick background, maybe B2 Venture is an early stage venture capital firm headquartered in St. Gallen, also with offices in Zurich and Berlin and Munich. And we have actually been investing in AI for quite a long time. So you already mentioned DeepL, which probably most people know, the language translation company, was kind of our first real AI investment back in 2009. And we've invested in several other companies, as you can see here. Some are really in AI tools, including some Swiss companies like Decentric, Latticeflow, and Kelvin Risk. Others more concentrate on vertical applications. And we also have a strong focus on AI-enabled digital health and healthcare, which traditionally has been one of the most successful areas of application. So I want to talk a bit about the AI market from an investor's perspective. And obviously, as we have heard, it's a very hyped market currently, quite overheated. And a lot of people have already asked, is this an iPhone moment? And what do we mean by that? In the last 50 years or so, we have really seen three major milestones in the technology market. So in the early 80s, there were the first PCs and home computers that suddenly made possible that you could own a computer at home or in your office, which was not possible before that. Then in the 90s, we had the first web browser, which meant that you suddenly could access this thing called the internet, which had been around for a while, but very hard to use. And then in 2007, you had the iPhone, by far not the first smartphone, of course, but the first one that really made this technology available for everyday use. Now about, I think, almost 7 billion people on the planet have a smartphone, so obviously became a major milestone in technology development. And now many people are saying, and I'm one of them, to be honest, that we have now seen, or are experiencing right now, the next big milestone in the form of this thing called generative AI, which is really reflected by ChatGPT and similar tools. Interestingly, you can actually have a discussion with this technology about the question if it's an iPhone moment. Here in this case, with our portfolio company TextCortex, which makes an AI voice, not voices, is an AI assistant mainly for marketing purposes. So first time you can really ask the technology if it's revolutionary. And again, people like Bill Gates, most of the leading venture capitalists, et cetera, say, yes, this is really on the same caliber here. Now, to look a little bit more closely at the different sector of this revolution, it's not just ChatGPT, even though that's top of mind, but there's a lot of tools that help you with coding. I'm coming back to that in a second. Then there's, of course, the text generation stuff like DeepL, ChatGPT, and so on. We have image generation models as well that help you create images out of nothing. And this is already getting adapted in all the usual tools like Photoshop and so on. And we have video and audio generation, which is a very exciting field. You can do really crazy stuff that was not possible before. For instance, you should try a tool called DID, which makes an artificial video of yourself or anybody you can upload a picture of, speaking lip sync against a recorded voice. So very fascinating stuff and also like slightly scary sometimes. And then we have a new generation of search engines, including Microsoft's modified Bing search with ChatGPT in the background, but also new players like U.com, Niva, and so on that are applying this technology to search. Of course, Google is now starting to roll out its own capabilities as well. So that's just as a broad overview. Now, first wave that we are seeing in the industry is that natural languages interfaces get adapted in traditional SaaS products. For instance, HubSpot and Salesforce, the two leading CRM companies, announced ChatGPT integration on the very same day. So this is going with a lot of speed. Right now, everybody has announced some kind of ChatGPT or similar strategy. We are still waiting for real products in the most cases. but we have already seen some cases where this stuff is starting to become useful as a new way to interact with more traditional software. But I think the most tangible field where we are seeing a real world impact right now is in programming. So when I started my career, I'm really old. In programming, we still had paper manuals. You still had to remember stuff and so on. And it was all very slow and clumsy. Then the internet completely changed that. And we really had websites like Stack Overflow, where you were suddenly able to find information about very specific programming questions. You still have to be able to apply this information here in a meaningful way. So you still have to be able to really think through the details. And now this latest generation of tools basically writes code for you. In this case here, I use the GitHub Copilot, which is owned by Microsoft. And I just gave it the 2 first lines of comments here that describe what I wanted it to do. In this case, in interaction with the Salesforce API, and it wrote the rest of this for me. Right. And that's obviously a huge booster in productivity. It mainly takes away all the boring stuff. So GitHub says that already 31% of new code on its platform is written with AI assistance. And first studies indicate that you have a productivity increase of at least 2 times for programmers. In many cases, it's even more like than that. Now, let's zoom out a bit to the broader AI and data space. AI and data is, of course, very closely related, because AI without the underlying training data and so on doesn't really make sense. So there's a lot of stuff going on in databases that are specific to the AI space and so on. Very exciting developments. And this is one of these typical market maps that are often used in venture capital, right? You don't have to read all of this. This is not even complete. Thousands of companies are in this broader space, right? In infrastructure, in analytics, in core machine learning, in open source, in APIs, and so on. There are all these different sectors here that are very active and are presumably well financed. The hottest sector by far is currently the sector here of our horizontal AI, or artificial general intelligence, where players like OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT, and all these other mostly smaller and bigger companies are currently active. And that's where really the big money is being thrown around. So Microsoft invested 10 billion in ChatGPT. Google invested 300 million, I think by now even more than that, in a smaller competitor, which is also making very good models. So big numbers here. And this is not where you play as an angel investor, frankly. The valuations here start typically at $500 million upwards, many unicorns here already. So that's really a completely overheated segment. But I think what is really interesting for investors right now is this field here on the right, the applications of all of this technology. And there are many buckets, of course, where you can apply this technology, and where there's plenty of space for strong startups. So it's in the enterprise segment, right? In all the traditional functions of a corporation, you have horizontal applications that go across functions, again, text, audio, voice, and all that stuff. And then you have industry-specific applications that really fulfill a particular use case in a certain industry. And that's probably where we see the most smaller scale activity right now. Many startups who have creative ideas how you could use this technology to solve a particular business problem. And what we are seeing behind the scenes is that AI companies are now suddenly starting to structure themselves a bit differently. So there was a question earlier in the chat about what does all of this mean for startups? And maybe to help with this question here, until recently, until all of this wave started, traditional AI companies looked a bit like that. They were basically full stack, right? So you had to have a user interface, of course, or kind of business logic, but the main value that it created was in building these complex AI models based ideally on proprietary training data. To give you an example, we have a Swiss portfolio company called Retinai, which makes image recognition software that scans retina scans of your eye's background, because there you can actually recognize certain kinds of diseases very early on. And they have proprietary data from Inselspital and other clinics, which enabled them to build a particularly reliable model. So that's your traditional full stack AI company. They have to also own a bit of infrastructure here. So it's all from the same company, basically. What we are now seeing is really a breakup into 2 very different types of companies. So here on the bottom, you have these model building companies like OpenAI, like Anthropic, and all these guys that build these pre-trained foundation models like GPT, and they use massive infrastructure for that. So that's stuff you can only do if you have infrastructure at hand that costs millions or even billions, because it's so compute intensive to train these models. And they make the stuff available then to other people through APIs. And then you have a second group of company, the application development companies with deep vertical expertise that, for instance, understand how do I apply this to medicine? How do I apply this to finance, et cetera, to marketing and so on. And they use APIs and fine-tune models to get this very high-end capability that you, for instance, get from GPT. They might add some smaller custom models on top of that to solve a specific problem a little bit more, with a little bit more focus or more cost efficiently. And that basically gives them capabilities that were not possible before. A good metaphor for that is cloud computing. So if you remember 20 years ago, if you had a software company, you had to own your own physical server machines, you had to pay for database licenses and so on. Now you go to Amazon, Google, or Microsoft and rent this stuff by the hour, and it's all pre-packaged for you. You don't have to worry about the details. That's very similar to what we are currently seeing in AI here. You don't necessarily have to understand how to do all of this stuff here in the basement. It just is available to you as a capability. And now, last slide, there's a lot of discussion about what does that mean for the market structure, right? So where do we go here? And one scenario that many people fear is that we are going to see a dominance of the big platforms. So the argument here is that building these huge models is so expensive that at the end of the day, only the big tech companies or the ones that are supported by the big tech companies like OpenAI can do that. And then you are going to have a lot of specialized small AI application companies, a little bit of tooling in between, but they all depend on what the big guys want to do, right? So it's very limited to how much freedom you have. If you run on Google's AI models and Google decides that they don't like your use case anymore, or they would build their own competitive product, then tough luck, you're out of business. And this is something that happened very similarly in mobile, right? You basically depend as a mobile app manufacturer on Apple and Google. If they don't like you, you're not in the App Store, you're dead. And that's what a lot of people fear could be happening here. Then the second scenario is a much more open ecosystem. That's what Michael already alluded to, right? So open source mentality. And there's a lot to be said for that. So we are seeing a lot of different players of different sizes, different backgrounds, who provide by now open and closed models. And there could be a whole generation of specialized AI application companies with a lot more tooling in between, which is also a field for startups that work with these underlying models here in many, many flexible ways that could be very dynamic, comparable to the Linux ecosystem and similar ones. So this would be more similar to Web 1.0 or Web 3, where you have this more open mentality. We believe that the currently most likely outcome is a bit of a hybrid between that, because there are objectively some fields where you will need huge amount of capital, right? So building something like GPT is not something that is easily feasible for a startup, will not for a while. And of course, the big ones develop their stuff further and become even more expensive. But there are a lot of fields where you can absolutely go with open source models that are much easier to build, much easier to run, and much cheaper to run. So that's probably what we are going to see, because there are a lot of these models that also have no really end user facing network effect. So bottom line is there's a lot of area here for startups and for startup investors to bet on. We currently believe that the best bets are really done here in these specialized AI applications. This stuff here in the model layer is really Wild West. You really need a very strong stomach, but there's also a lot of interesting stuff going on in the tooling sector in between. We have seen specialized databases that have already turned into unicorns after a few months in business. So there's a lot of activity in all these layers. So these are a few of the pointers I want to give you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So I'm a little bit flashed about the content you have provided. So we promise that we're going not to make the hype more hypey, but to go a little bit deeper into that. And I think both both speeches have shown us that's on the one side really like not so a big problem. On the other side, the confusion is going maybe to clear a little bit also with your presentation. Somebody asked if you would make the presentation available. Andreas, we didn't talk before about that, but we can that. Okay, that's
can
nice.
do that. Yeah,
thank you very much. Good. So thank you very much. The first question maybe to Michael, when you have seen what Andreas has presented. So what's your strategy or what you would suggest for a startup of these two models? Now you already invested a lot of money, time, brain into a thing, and now everything looks like available and much larger data. So maybe elaborate a little bit on that, on the startup view on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, yeah, first of all, I think it's fair enough what Andreas said, that it's probably a kind of a hybrid scenario, but both scenarios are possible or will exist in a way. And well, what we recognize is, or our experience, we already have KT running at various companies like legal insurance companies, but also in the government organizations. And what we see is that we really have to be very specific about adding value, you know. So, for example, to give you a very concrete example, that, you know, anti-money laundering, you have the laws and regulations are published on admin.ch, you know, the FedEx basically. And, you know, if we are able to make this available to anti-money laundering lawyers, specialists, you know, in a good and easy way, you know, we can provide an added value, which probably Microsoft or Google will not provide out of the box, basically. So if we can really find niches, you know, very specific cases, I think we definitely have a chance. I mean, I think if you take DeepL as an example, I think DeepL is a very good example in this sense too. You know, I mean, everyone used, I would argue, you know, first there was, what was it called from, you know, before there was Google Translate. Lingui as a company, but no, before, you know, the Babel, I think there was Babelfish. I think it was by IBM, I think, you know, first people used this. Then Google Translate came along, and then I think people forgot about Babelfish, and everyone used Google Translate. And then came DeepL, and DeepL, even if they didn't have so many languages, you know, but I mean, of course, DeepL claimed their translations are 3 times better than Google Translate, which I think, depending on the benchmark, it's true or not true. But I mean, for me personally, I really thought, well, yeah, this is really great. It's really better, you know. And I didn't care so much about that they didn't offer 180 languages. For me, the most important is that they really offered German, English in a very good way, you know, and very simple. And so I started to use this. So I think really, and I think the reason, I mean, and Andreas knows this probably much better because he invested in DeepL. But my understanding is, you know, it's not the model itself. It's not they also cook with water, but the pre and post processing, they do better. You know, they have better, higher quality data, how they do the things, and they could really make a difference. You know, and by this, they really became successful. And out of this niche, were able to expand and able to use B2B basically to be very successful. And I think, so this is, I think, for us, for ourselves as a startup, but I think for all the other startups, I think it's very important to find these niches and where you can really compete. I mean, in the end, it's like, you know, basically what this book 0 to 1 of Peter Thiel is saying, you have to find a niche where you are 10 times better than your competitors. And you have to find this, and then you can go out of this, basically. So
that's my question to Andreas. Now you have a big portfolio of AI companies, and there was kind of a revolution November 22. What are your companies doing, or what do you advise them to do? Just to say, they spend a lot of time and money into something which is maybe excellent and very good, but with ChatGPT, the world changed, the expectation changed, and And even people think they can do everything themselves in the companies if you are B2B.
Yes. I mean, somebody asked in the chat if we have any startups that face a threat through these LLMs. And my answer to that would be Google right now faces a threat, right? The most profitable company in the world next to Apple and total dominance in search and so on. They are in panic mode right now to catch up with that stuff. So in other words, if you're not if you don't feel paranoid about that as a startup or even as an established tech company, you're not paying attention, right? This is the bottom line. And what does this specifically mean? I mean, what we advise our companies to do is to really drill into quite some detail, understanding which customer problem could we solve differently, better, more cheaply using this new technology. And in some cases, the answer is, well, not that much, right? It might be a nice additional user interface element or something like that. But in other ways, it can be very transformational, right? And anything that has to do with the manipulation of information will be changed through that stuff. So it is often not okay to just slap a chat interface on top of your software and use a bit of GPT matching in the background to do something cool. That nothing wrong with that, but you should never stop with that with your strategic discussion, but really think well beyond that. And in some cases, it is quite interesting how fundamentally the world is being shaken by these new developments. So once we have one company that makes tools for data scientists, and they have catered to this traditional data scientist that I showed earlier, right? This monolithic or full stack AI company there, they build everything in-house and so on. And now they don't know how to react to LLMs because it's suddenly a completely different game. Suddenly you have to care about how to write these prompts that you send to the language models and how to process the output, which can be very messy and so on. So at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity for these established companies, but also a lot of danger. So I think you really have to be up on your toes and constantly deal with this change. And it's going extremely rapidly. I mean, I was recently on vacation for a week and didn't pay attention to that. When I came back, it felt like I already was in a different year or decade because so much had changed in these few days. That it's a crazy market, and I personally have never seen anything like that. Again, I don't want to add to the hype, but very objectively, I've been in mobile, I've been in the .com bubble, and it moves faster than that currently.
So what you're saying is that existing startups with existing clients should adapt the technology. That's also what Michael says as a principle. Is there enough skills around? Do they have to hire new people, or can they work with existing people? So I mean, just actually saying if somebody was in AI space, neural networks, can you really fastly adapt that? Or is it that we have to hire new persons on board? So both of you, just a short answer on that.
The interesting thing is that suddenly software engineers who don't really know much about AI can deploy AI capabilities. And we have seen many cases, even at established companies that cranked out some cool AI application in 2 weeks, where they normally would have needed 2 years before that, right? And that's the difference. And I think for traditional AI people, they have to adapt to this new mode of thinking, and that's probably going to take a little bit of time to do that. But I mean, if you're already skilled in AI, you can adapt to this quite easily once you get to it.
I agree in the sense, I also think you can really do things very quickly today. There are many libraries, tools, and etc. I think one challenge is so that it's a question of quality, what you want to accomplish. As I said before, when we talked about this, before the webinar, if your goals, objectives are just to fill the white page to give you an idea, great. But then, if you really have to have correct and perfect answers, you will not be able to do this so easily. And then again, you need highly skilled people, basically. I think I don't know, I should have looked up the English term for Trennung von Spreu und Weizen, but you really have, it depends on the situation. Again, I think and this is something we recognize, that depending on what we want to accomplish. you know, we really need different kind of skill sets, basically, or level of skills.
Okay, thank you. So everybody's asking what's the next big thing, like the iPhone moment. So we heard coding, so software development, productivity should be one of the low-hanging fruits. Are there others you see there? But there was some of the questions were in that direction.
I think customer care is also a huge topic, you know, because, I mean, if you think about, for example, if you take Digitec Galaxus, you know, as far as I know, they have really a lot of people doing customer care, basically. And of course, if you can support them, you know, and make this more efficient, it's not just about saving money, but it's also to have customer satisfaction, you know, because today, depending on which company, retailer you talk to, you have to wait a long time, basically, and you get unhappy, whether it be a retailer or health insurance or whatever. So if you can make this better, you know, you can improve customer satisfaction, and this is one of the top objectives of these companies.
Good.
I would maybe add,
you see?
I mean, the question, what is the killer application of AI, is a bit like asking, what's the killer application for the internet? Pretty much everything, right? When you consider how much time you spend in front of screens, how you watch TV differently, etc., right? It's almost an endless list. So I think that's the way to think about it. It's a foundational technology that will potentially change every piece of technology, and already has to some extent. And I think the trick is not what is the biggest thing that is going to happen, because the answer is yes, everything will change, right? Again, I don't want to overhype it. It's just that kind of technology. So the better question is, especially from an investor and startup point of view, is where do you have specific knowledge and understanding to understand how to apply this stuff to a particularly relevant customer problem, right? A particular sub-market that is interesting, where not everybody's piling on. And I think there are more than enough big and small markets where a lot of creativity is going to happen. It's already happening right now.
So I assume also the portfolio theory is still applicable. So just not
100%.
invest in one, try to cover a lot of topics if you think that technology is a game changer. So, and that's actually, we're coming to the end about the game changing. I hope everybody enjoyed both presentation as I did. Thank you very much, Michael and Andreas. It's just very, very lovely to see that. Sorry, guys, that we couldn't answer all the questions, but it's an hour. And if we want to go deeper in that question, you still know the guys here if you have a specific question. I want to thank you, Christian, for organizing and hosting the technology part. So SIGTIC is the Angel Club in Switzerland. And if you're not member of it, now it's a chance, because we know these guys and we know much more other guys and investors who are smart and clever. And I hope we have to do a lot of ChatGPT and other investments in the future, or extension rounds for companies who are going into that field. Thank you very, very much for attending. Have a nice, lovely afternoon. And I say goodbye for everybody. See you soon in an event of SIGTIC. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.